All right. So we are diving into chapter 2 of your NASM textbook today. This is going to be the start to our PFT 100 class. So this is essentials and fitness assessments, right? So what that means, just to give you guys an idea of the concept of what we are going for in teaching this course. We want to break down how to understand fitness assessments very, very clearly. We want to understand like how to assess a client, because that's going to determine, what type of activity you give them, what type of exercise you give them, how you choose your exercises, sort of what type of mobility work they need that's unique to them. This is all very much a really big part of our industry. And it's the difference between writing a general workout for a client that might be like a pre-designed something that you put together, which could be good. I don't have anything against pre-designed workouts. They can be a supplemental tool in your tool belt. But I guarantee you'll go a lot further. You'll have a lot more success with your clients and in your careers by writing specific workouts to your client, right? Like Lorianne, just to kind of use you as an example, you said you have like ataxia, right? Like that is a condition that really makes it a very difficult thing to balance, right? So if that's the case, then we, as your trainer, I would put a lot of emphasis on balance training. That would be really important to me. Very similarly, if I train a client with like multiple sclerosis, right, MS, which isn't mentioned in your textbooks, unfortunately, but that's a neurological disorder that also causes muscle weakness and balance problems. Now, I cannot cure any of that, as a trainer, right? Like, we can't cure anything as trainers, but through general exercise, we can have a very, very positive effect on them. So if I'm performing a fitness assessment and I notice that balance is a struggle, I'm going to put a big emphasis on balance training throughout the program that I write. If I have another client who, let's say they are struggling with like certain rounded shoulder problems, I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on trying to pull those shoulders back and do a lot of rowing actions. So everybody's going to get a little bit of a different workout. And we need to understand like what exercises address these individual unique problems that our clients might have. Because everybody does have, unique things, right? So that's why we're going to be definitely looking at our anatomy again, and we're going to be looking at our physiology again, and then we will definitely be looking at kinesiology again. I always like to tell people this class is kind of like kinesiology 2. It's like kinesiology's little brother. It's not quite as difficult as our kinesiology class. I know some of you guys who are just coming out of that mod are like, oh God, kinesiology. That class, PFT 119, is probably our most challenging class. But this is sort of like the younger brother to that. It is going to be a little bit less on looking at muscle actions and memorizing, what their concentric motions are and their eccentric motions and things like that. It's a little bit less of that, and a little bit more of understanding, all right, if I've got a client whose shoulders are rounding forward, what muscles are pulling those shoulders into that rounded position? So now I know what muscles to stretch, and then what muscles are being pulled that are, too relaxed, too lengthened, too weakened. How do I strengthen those muscles, right? We address that by understanding our fitness assessments. So it will be a lot of talks on posture in this course. It will also be a lot of talks on the cardiorespiratory system, because that's a big part of assessing things. You might have somebody with great posture, but their cardio sucks. Then they're going to get a lot of cardio in their routines, So this is really going to help inform us on how we should really build our programs. So the purpose of this lecture today is to give you guys a pretty good understanding of the structure and the function of, we're going to be talking about the first two parts of the kinetic chain, right? And by understanding that, you'll have insight on how the human body sort of operates. So our objectives today, we want to understand the basic functions of our nervous system and our skeletal system, and then talk about how those systems both adapt and respond to exercise. So Bay, you've heard me say it a million times, but like I said, everything at Sochi is very circular, and you will see things multiple times. It's official. This is the first time you are getting to see this PowerPoint again. So if you didn't get it the first round, hopefully you feel a little bit more confident after today. Do you remember, I don't know if you remember where I was like, nobody ever believes me, but trust me, it will feel much easier the second time around.
Yeah, I remember.
Today's the day where I'm proved not a liar. So, and Lorianne, I'm sure we will probably have this conversation in a couple weeks, because inevitably every new Sochi student has this moment where they're like, there was a lot of information and we moved past it really quick. And I was like, trust me, it's coming back. All right. So looking at the human movement system, we often call the human movement system the kinetic chain. So it's the kinetic chain. More commonly, we call it the human movement system. You've got all kinds of different systems in your body, right? Like you've got your cardiorespiratory system, you've got your digestive system, your endocrine system, your immune system, your integumentary system, reproductive systems, which is everybody's favorite. But then we've got the human movement system. That's our main, this is the system. These are the organs that all come together to help us produce our everyday movements, right? And the three parts of that big sort of overall system that manipulates our movement are going to be your nervous system, your muscular system, and the skeletal system. So we call this the kinetic chain because it's three interdependent systems that create human movement, right? And we like the term chain because, well, we like kinetic chain because kinetic means, movement. It means forces, right? And chain is like a series of things that are linked together. And so this is a really good way to understand, like, oh, all of these systems are interdependent, right? Like one relies on the other. You always hear that phrase, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, right? Well, that could not be more true of the kinetic chain. If one of the components of the kinetic chain is out of whack, then it's going to negatively affect the other components. If your muscles cannot contract the way that they're supposed to, it might draw your skeletal system into a range of motion that might cause like aches and pains, or result in like a ligament tear or something. And now, or if your muscular system is recruiting muscles in the wrong way, your nervous system is getting used to that exposure and it's getting used to moving in that wrong way, which explains why all of us have this forward head posture because of freaking smartphones. So they all work together, right? If your nervous system can't coordinate signals properly, it won't be able to recruit your muscles the way it's supposed to, which is going to affect, again, how your skeletal system moves. So we're going to be looking at the first two parts of this system today. That is going to be your nervous system, and we're going to be looking at your skeletal system. And just before I dive into it, a quick overview of each of these, because I guess I do have these definitions here. Your nervous system, that's responsible for creating a communication network in the body. That's what that system does. It's coordinating signals and interpreting data. Your muscular system is responsible for creating internal tension in order to manipulate your skeletal system and create human movement. So the muscular system is actually what's like, moving you around, but it's told how to do that by your nervous system. And then your skeletal system gives you the framework. This is giving you your freaking body. It protects your delicate structures. It allows you to have a series of levers that can be manipulated. That's the skeletal system in a nutshell. And it's under the control of your muscular system because the skeletal system will move based on how your muscular system moves. And the muscular system is controlled by the nervous system. So like I said, it is a chain. And if any of those links are messed up, it's going to sort of affect all of them. Let me know if I'm moving a little bit too quick, by the way, on these notes and stuff. You know, if you're having trouble getting these down, just let me know. I will be sending these notes out later to you, just so you're aware, in the email later today. So you can always, like, if you miss something, you can copy them down. Or what a lot of people do, I tell people to take notes during class. What a lot of people do is they will print these, and I've seen people just like kind of write in the white parts. They'll put their own little notes in there, and that's always really handy. Okay, so looking at the nervous system, you know, like I said, it's one of the main organ systems of your body. Its job, it is a series of cells that are going to coordinate signals throughout the body. So this is your communication network, right? If I need to get information from my brain to my foot, and then, you know, I need to have like a communication, I need to have like a network, you know, where it can kind of go from almost like telephone pole to telephone pole to telephone pole until eventually it gets to where it's going and, you know, enters. And then suddenly it's going to say, hey, foot, we want you to, you know, curl over like this, right? And then the foot's got to send a signal back to the brain saying like, got it, brain, I'm doing it, which that has to travel through that same communication network. So that's why communication really kind of describes the nervous system really, really well. It's information going out and information coming back. So the nervous system is going to have two primary divisions here. You're going to have your central nervous system, which is going to be your brain and your spinal cord. This is sort of the command center for your entire nervous system, right? Like the central nervous system is in charge of coordinating all the signals. It makes all of the decisions. The analogy that I always like to use is your central nervous system is kind of like the CEO of a company, right? Like they're in charge of making all of the major decisions about how that company is run. So, you know, they're the boss who's kind of in charge of everything, but they're not obviously able to do all the work themselves. So we have to have another division of our nervous system that is going to be our peripheral nervous system. And your peripheral nervous system are all of your peripheral nerves that are running throughout your body. Oh, excuse me. So the peripheral nerves are sort of like the factory workers that work under that CEO. So the CEO might make a decision and say like, hey, this is how we want to do things. And then it has to say, you know, send a memo out that goes to someone and says, hey, like you are now going to do this, right? And so then that factory worker is going to do whatever task they're supposed to. And then they're going to send a signal back to the CEO that says, hey, I got my job done, right? And so that's how there's sort of a constant communication between your central and your peripheral nervous system. If we look at this, if we look at sort of the divisions here, if we look at the difference between your central and your peripheral systems, you can actually see here. Wrong button. This is your central system in sort of the dark orange here, right? Like I said, it's the brain and the spinal cord. This is where all the decision making gets made, right? But then you've got all of the peripheral branches, like every one of your individual spinal discs. Nerves are going to branch out from that, and they're going to travel throughout the entire body. That does not end here, by the way. It goes everywhere. I don't know why this picture stops here, but all of these peripheral nerves are going to branch out. So let's say like you touch something really hot with your hand, right? Information is going to go back to the brain, and it's going to travel up, and then it's going to go right here to the spinal cord. And it's going to go up to the brain and say like, hey, this thing that we're touching, like this cup of tea or this cup of coffee is really actually pretty hot. We can probably hold this for like the next 10 seconds, but we should probably put it down after that. Right? And so the brain's going to go, what level pain? Oh, yeah, no. Yeah, about 10 to 15 seconds. Like in 15 seconds, we're going to let those muscles go. So then it sends a signal back that says, all right, well, you can keep recruiting the muscles in the forearm to kind of hold on to that coffee cup, but then eventually I want you to let it go, right? So that is sort of like the signal comes in, the brain interprets it, and then it sends a response back. So that's your central and your peripheral system. The central system makes the decisions. The peripheral system sort of carries out those decisions. And it also gives your brain the information. There's sort of two jobs of the peripheral, right? It's either giving the brain the info or it is executing the brain's decisions. Now, looking at your nervous system and how it actually functions, right? So now we understand a little bit about like the structures of our nervous system. But if we're looking at like how our nervous system actually, like what's its job, right? Like when I say it's a communication network, what does that really mean, right? Well, what it means is that it is able to gather information about both our internal and our external environments, process that information, and respond, right? So let's go to the internal environment because it's pretty easy to understand the external environment. But let's just say you eat like a cookie, right? So that cookie moves down your esophagus into your stomach. And once it's in your stomach, like that cookie, for the most part, it's, you've been chewing it up, you've mixed it with your saliva, and you've broken it down like, fairly well. And cookies break down pretty easily because they're mostly just like very simple carbohydrates, right? But, it's still going to have to take a little bath in, all of your stomach acid for a little while until it can get broken down into this really wet, soupy mixture. And the way that your stomach knows it's like, okay, you know what? That's wet and soupy enough to move into the diet, to the actual absorption phase. We can move it from the stomach into the small intestine now. The way that your stomach knows to do that is there is internal sensory receptors in your stomach. So there are stretch receptors. And if you run like a really solid piece of food over that stretch receptor, it'll overstretch it. So then the stomach goes, whoa, that's a solid piece of food. That's not ready for absorption. And it'll close the stomach off. And then food won't escape. It does that through what we call we call it a sphincter. And so that will actually close down, right? But then as soon as it's like really wet and soupy and it kind of moves across that and it's not really intensely stretching that receptor, then the stomach goes, oh, okay, well, that's fully broken down. And so then it opens up and it allows it to move in. Now, obviously, you don't have any control of any of that. Like none of us in here can go and like squeeze our stomach or anything like that. And when I say stomach, I mean the organ, not your core. We can't really effectively do that consciously. But there is like sensory information that's happening. Your brain is interpreting that information, and then it's executing the appropriate response. Looking at an example of your body responding to your external environment, we can use the classic example of maybe touching something really sharp. So let's say your hand touches something really sharp. And so receptors that say, wow, that's freaking sharp, travel up to your brain, and your brain goes, oh no, that's definitely going to tear our skin open. Then it's going to send a signal back and you're going to jerk your hand away, right? So three primary functions here that your nervous system that your nervous system does. Those three primary functions are going to be sensory function, which is the ability of the nervous system to sense changes in either the internal or the external environment. So your sensory function of your nervous system, like I said, it's like stretch receptors in your stomach. It's like sensory receptors in your palm or in your muscles, right? Like if I grab like a 10-pound dumbbell, how do I know, not to use too much muscle and jerk my arm, a million miles an hour towards the ceiling? How do I know to only recruit about 10 pounds worth of force to raise that dumbbell gently? Well, sensory function, right? My brain's going to say, oh, okay, that's about how much weight is being placed on the muscles there. That's about 10 pounds worth, right? And then we've got integrative function. Integrative function is what happens after sensory function. So sensory function gives you it gathers data. Oh, that's not where I meant to throw that. Definitely just knock some stuff over. Sensory function is gathering data, right? And then you have integrative function. Integrative function is your nervous system's ability to analyze and interpret that data, that sensory information, and that allows for the proper decision making. Okay. And that's how we sort of produce responses, right? So, when I was a kid, the example that I always love to use for people, when I was a little kid, I had this really dumb habit. I don't know why I did this, but my parents saw me do it like a bunch of times, where I would place my thumb over the metal part of like a plug. So like if I were plugging something in like this, I would like hold it like that, where and then I would try to like guide it into the wall. Basically bridging the electric outlet and my body. And I never got electrocuted for a long time. My parents would be like, stop doing it that way. Stop doing it. They would tell me all the time. And finally, my dad was like, whatever. He's going to get electrocuted one of these days. After that, he's not going to do that again. And sure enough, one day they asked me to plug in my grandma's vacuum cleaner so that I could help my mom vacuum. And man, that thing shocked the crap out of me. I felt like my hair was standing up on end, like it was brutal. And you will bet that I never held my hand over a plug like that ever again. So sensory information came in the form of an electric current shocking the crap out of me. And then integrative function said, maybe we shouldn't do that again. It analyzed and interpreted the data, right? So how does your brain know how to lift 10 pounds of force? It has done it before, and it stored the information and it remembered how to do it. And so it's going to do it again. Now, there is the last half of things, which is kind of what we've already bled into just a little bit, which is motor function. So the last function of your nervous system is motor function. That's the neuromuscular response to sensory information. So let's say you touch something really hot, like really hot, right? Well, then your integrative function is going to go, whoa, warning, big hot. We got to get that hand off of there, right? And then it will then say, okay, the best way to do that, right? This is your brain using integrative function. The best way to do that would be to recruit the biceps muscle to retract the arm and perform elbow flexion, right? So then you're touching it and it's really, really hot. And so then you're going to go elbow flexion, right? So information comes from the palm, up my body, goes to my spinal cord, goes up to my brain makes a decision, it goes down the spinal cord, and then it goes to my bicep muscle to draw my hand away. And those are sort of the three main functions of our nervous system. That's every thought that you make, every action that you take is all determined by those sort of three functions working together. Now, let's say all this information is constantly happening, right? This information is going to and fro. It's just happening constantly, back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. This gives us what I think is the most important concept of the day. If you forget everything that I taught you today, but you remember one thing, I would say remember what we're about to talk about here. All of that information going away and information coming back is what we refer to as proprioception. Proprioception is the body's ability to sense the relative position of adjacent body parts, which is a big fancy way to say it's our spatial awareness, right? It's your body's ability to understand where it is in space, right? So, if I take my hand back behind my head and I wiggle my fingers, right? How do I know I'm actually successfully wiggling my fingers? Now, a very basic answer would be, because you're the one telling it to happen, right? Like, obviously you just say, well, you're the one who's saying wiggle your finger, so of course you know it's happening. Okay, great. Here's the thing though. I've told many people to do many things many times, but it hasn't always happened. Right? So you could say something, you could tell a body part to do something every day. How do you know it actually got done? That's what's tricky, right? So how do I know that information actually, or how do I know that movement actually occurred? Well, that is where proprioception comes in, right? It's not only information going out, it's also information coming back in. So what's happening is I'm sending a signal that says wiggle your fingers, and then I'm getting a signal from each one of those fingers telling me what position it's in and how it is moving. That's giving me spatial awareness. This is one of the reasons why, like, if I wanted to close my eyes right now and go grab that scarf that I know is on my door, for the most part, I could probably stand up, keep my eyes closed, see how well I do this, walk to, I'm assuming, probably right about, oh, nope, it's closer than I thought. Right about here and grab it, right? So my spatial awareness was not perfect there. I almost ran into the freaking door. But for the most part, like, I was able to get pretty darn close fairly accurately, even without being able to see, because of proprioception. My brain knows about how long my legs are. My brain knows about how far this is. And so if I take 3 or 4 steps, that's enough to get me where I'm going. And then it knows that, the scarf is a couple inches up off the ground, about this far off the ground. That's relatively similar to where my hip bone is. So if I reach forward around my hip bone, I'm going to be able to grab that. So that's what proprioception is. It's really important for us as personal trainers to spend a lot of time understanding and training for proprioception, because a lot of people have alterations in their posture without realizing it. When you look at like someone who has just like statically rounded shoulders, right? When you think about like this rounded shoulder posture, they might think that this is their neutral position, when in fact their neutral position is something like that, right? Their shoulders retracted and depressed away from their ears. But they've altered their proprioception over time. So all movement, all human movement, which is what we're really here to talk about, right, is a response to the sensory information. So it's all under the control of your nervous system. Your brain is getting information coming in, and it is then like interpreting that information in order to execute the appropriate responses. This is one of the reasons why it's very important for us as trainers to train our clients, and us as people who are also just exercising regularly. We need to train in what we call multi-sensory environments, which is a big fancy way of saying like wobbly environments. NASM is really big on training in unstable situations, because that is the best way to develop your nervous system, right? So like we need to stand on one. If you're gonna do bicep curls, great, but do them on one leg. If you're gonna do shoulder presses, awesome. Try to do those on one leg, right? Not always, but often, right? And what that will do is that will develop your proprioception, your balance, and your overall coordination. Any questions so far, guys? Everybody feeling pretty good? Nothing. All right. Love it. Okay. That's a little bit of like the concept of the nervous system. Let's go ahead and look at some of the anatomy, right? If all that was like, our function, let's go ahead and take a look at some of the pieces of our nervous system. So in your nervous system, you are going to have it's made up of billions and billions and billions of neurons. And what a neuron is, we call it the functional unit of the nervous system, because your nervous system is made of billions of these things. And what it is just like any other cell inside the body. It's a human cell, right? But it's one thing that you're going to hear me say all the time is form follows function. This is probably my favorite phrase ever. And a lot of times it's been kind of co-opted. It's kind of been co-opted by like friggin' like I think the guy that first said it was so not even co-opted, I guess, was an architect. But it applies to the world of biology really, really well. When you think about the idea that like form follows function, right? Let's take a look here. we've got three very different forms of skeletal systems here, right? You can see you've got like a human arm, you've got a bat's arm, and you've got a dolphin's arm. Now, here's the thing. All of these creatures are mammals. And they actually all follow a very similar structure because they are mammals. They actually have one bone here, two bones here, and then a whole bunch of bones that break down into their palm. With the bat, same situation. One bone here. You can see there's two bones right there, and then lots of little bones making up. They don't really have a palm. They have like a big wing that makes it very easy for them to kind of fly through the air. And in dolphins, right? One bone here, two bones here, and then this, which allows them to kind of, have like a fin. So you'll notice the form of each of these things looks very, very different. We're moving through the air, like we're just walking around land. We don't want to have drag. We want to be able to slice through the air easily. So our hands are pretty thin. They've got some space between the fingers. That actually makes us better at picking stuff up as well. But like all of the form here allows us to function in a very specific way. But this is terrible for flying. You see cartoon characters walk off a cliff and then do this thing. Doesn't help. It's not going to have any effect, right? So our arms are not all that great for flying, but a bat's arms are fantastic at it, right? Because they've also got this like skin that's there as well. This wide splayed out thing makes it really easy to trap massive amounts of air if you're trying to fly, but it makes it horrible for just like, if a bat had to like run on two legs as fast as it could, it'd basically be like running with parachutes on the sides of its arms. And it would be terrible at it, right? So the form gives it a very specific function. And the same thing is true of dolphins. You think about like maybe moving through air and moving through water is kind of similar, but there's very different because like air is very light, it's a gas versus like liquid, which is a very heavy solid. This needs really big bones. Look at how large the freaking bones are in a very fin-like situation, similar to the bat's wing, but still very different, right? So again, form follows function. So you're going to hear me say that a lot. It's literally my favorite thing to say. I always tell people, if you want to understand like how anything in this world works, anything in the universe works, just remember that form follows function. And it's like nothing got that way randomly. It only got that way because it was shaped to get that way. And if you understand that, I promise it makes understanding the world a lot easier. So if we look at the nervous system and we understand that function follows form, your nerve cells are very specially designed. Let's go ahead and pull up a bigger picture of a neuron here. So your neuron, you can see, has all these little fingers that branch off of it. And then it's got these really big, long tails, right? Well, those big, long tails make it really good at being able to stretch from place to place. And then those fingers make it really good at intertwining and locking together so that they can stay attached to one another. And that is what makes our communication network that we talked about, right? If you think about like, if I just type in, let's see here, network. If I pick up a picture of a network, what comes up? Yeah, perfect. A network is a bunch of stuff that's all connected, right? Like it's a big freaking crazy looking web where this guy's attached to this guy and this guy and this guy, right? That's what a network is. Well, your neurons look exactly like that. If we look at like a neuron network, yeah, billions and billions and billions and billions of connections. There's a great one. Look at that. All of these neurons are all connected to one another. So they are, your neuron's shape is designed to be able to connect to other neurons, right? Now, in that you will see the cell body. That's going to be all the normal stuff you'll see in like a cell, right? Like you're going to see, a nucleus in there. You're going to see mitochondria, all the totally normal animal cell stuff that you normally see. But the special shape that you're going to see on a neuron is the big long tail, and that tail is called an axon. So when you look at a neuron here and you see these big long tails, that is your axon. So the axon is where, an electrochemical signal is going to have to travel through that axon from place to place in order to get where it's going, because I need to be able to connect my brain to my big toe, and they are not close together. So I need to have a lot of like axon length to be able to get it there. And then you've got all of these little dendrites. Dendrites are these little fingers here. Okay. And those fingers, that's a dendrite, by the way, in Greek, it means tree, because it looks like the branches of a tree. So your dendrites are going to gather information, and then that information is going to get transmitted from the dendrite into the cell body. It'll travel down the axon, and then it's going to travel to whatever the next neuron that it needs to get to is. So if I need to get a signal, again, from my brain down to my foot, it's going to travel from one neuron to through the axon, through the dendrites of the next neuron down. All right, technical difficulties. Sorry, guys, my internet must have just crapped out. Everybody with me? Can I get a check in here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Here.
Andres, Kenny, you
Yep.
guys still with me?
I'm here.
Yeah, we're here.
All right, cool. Good Lord. That has not happened in a very long time. All right, where were we? So an electrochemical signal, right? A nervous system signal. It's going to travel from the dendrites down to the cell body, down the axon, into the dendrites of the next neuron, down its axon, into the dendrites of the next neuron, and so on and so forth. And it's going to repeat until eventually it travels through the dendrites of a neuron, down the axon, and then it interacts with a muscle. And that's what we'll get into in a couple of days. But that's where we have sort of the structures here. Now, there are 3 different types of neurons. And you will notice these 3 types of neurons are pretty similar to the 3 functions of our nervous system. Again, form follows function. If the neuron is the nervous system, you've got 3 main categories of neurons here. You are going to have sensory neurons. And sensory neurons are the types of neurons that are going to transmit what we call an afferent nerve impulse from an effector site to the brain or to the spinal cord. And so sensory neurons are in charge of gathering information and getting that information to my brain, right? So they sense that a muscle, let's like an example is, let's say like a muscle is being lengthened out, right? Let's say you're stretching a muscle, right? Then sensory information is going to sense that that muscle is being pulled apart, and it's going to send that signal to the brain. So for instance, let's say I decide to go touch my toes, right? I'm standing here and I decide to hinge over at the waist and reach for my toes, right? So what's going to happen is if I'm here, I'm not getting much information. My brain's like, nope, hamstrings are fine. And if I start to go to like here, now my brain's getting information saying, the hamstring's being pulled apart a little bit. But you know what? It's got plenty of room to move. We're fine, right? So I don't feel any tightness here. But then as I start to get lower and lower and lower, right? What's going to start to happen is I'm going to get a deeper and more intense signal that's going to travel up to my brain. And so now it's saying, whoa, 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 whoa. Hey, we're getting to full length here. You can only go to here and you're here, right? Slow your roll, right? Sensory information is saying, hey, you're really getting into a lengthened position here. And so, you know, that's what your sensory neurons do. If you touch something really hot, sensory neurons are going to pick up on that. We've got a lot of different types of sensory neurons. We'll be talking about those when we get into the muscular system. You've got some that are in charge of sensing tension. You've got some that are in charge of sensing the length of your muscles. You've got some that are sensing acceleration or deceleration, gravity, you know, all kinds of different sensory neurons. And then you've got the response, right? So for me, when I start to overstretch my hamstrings, because I did, you know, yesterday was leg day, so I'm real freaking sore today. If I start to hinge like this, you'll notice the lower I get, what's going to want to happen is my knees want to buckle, right? Because what that means If I can buckle my knees, my hamstrings don't have to stretch anymore, right? So they're super tight and they go, no, 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 bend that knee joint. And so that's the motor response to the sensory information. Sensory information says, wow, that's tight. And then the motor response is, well, in that case, take the tension off. If it's so tight, let go. And that's what we're kind of seeing there. So motor neurons are sort of the opposite of sensory neurons, or at least they're traveling in the opposite direction. They transmit nerve impulses from the brain to an effector site, such as like a muscle or an organ, right? So a muscle might contract in response to being over lengthened. If you overstretch something, it'll want to buckle. It'll want to contract in response. And then there are interneurons, which are going from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron. Because obviously we don't have, one single cell that's transmitting from my brain all the way down to, my hamstrings. It's a pretty long distance. So if it's traveling from neuron to neuron to neuron to neuron, we call your interneurons. So a sensory neuron would allow me to gather sensory function. Then my nervous system would use integrative function to decide on the appropriate response, and would use motor neurons to execute that response. So those are our three types of neurons there. Any questions on that, guys? Questions, comments, or concerns before we move on to the next section? Cool. All right, so now let's go ahead and take a look at our, if we're going to divide our nervous system up, we do have to divide it into several different sections so that we understand what part is responsible for, what section, right? So you've got your central nervous system. That is going to be your brain and your spinal cord. And then you've got your peripheral nervous system. And your peripheral nervous system is going to divide into two primary divisions. So when we look at this, right, we've got our central, man, that's too big. We've got our central nervous system here, right? Like I said, it's the command center, right? And then we've got our peripheral nervous system right here. And that sort of carries out all the work. So these two are really like kind of connected to one another, right? But your peripheral nervous system is going to divide into two primary divisions, okay? It's going to divide down into the two types of thoughts that you have, or the two types of actions that you have. It is going to divide into your somatic actions, which are voluntary actions. Right? So that's your somatic nervous system. This is your very voluntary, you are consciously deciding to do something, part of your nervous system. So when you decide to contract your biceps, for instance, that is a somatic response. The peripheral nervous system is controlling that somatically. It's conscious, you are deciding to do it. But if we use my example that I used earlier with the stomach, right? Where your stomach has stretch receptors and it decides whether to open or close, right? That is going to be what is called an autonomic nervous response. So your autonomic nervous system is your involuntary, automatic nervous system. So when you think of your autonomic system, you can think of all the things that happen without you really having to think about it, right? You drank a bottle of water earlier, now you got to go pee. Luckily, you didn't have to think about like, okay, I should probably be filtering out that water. Kidneys, filter that water. Great. Now put any of the excess in my bladder. Great. Right? Like that'd be a lot of work. Imagine if you had to, even like autonomically, imagine having to like control your heart rate all day, right? Like just constantly, you're just like beat, 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 beat. Yeah, can I get a bucket of grapes? Beat, beat, okay. Like you'd have to like think of way too many things. So luckily, our nervous system does a lot of things without us having to consciously think about it. That's where your autonomic nervous system comes in. Now, unfortunately, what comes along with something being autonomic is that sometimes things can work in a way that we might not necessarily want them to, or more severely than we really want them to. And that's where we've got two more divisions here, which is going to be your sympathetic nervous system, which is more commonly called your fight or flight system. This is the system that kind of freaks out about stuff, right? Like if you get very nervous about something, that is your sympathetic nervous system. You don't really have much control over that sometimes. But then we've got our parasympathetic, which is your rest and digest system. So the parasympathetic nervous system is sort of the like opposite of the sympathetic nervous system. Its job is to kind of calm you down, right? So, you know, I'm sure we've all experienced this where maybe you've been, you know, maybe you've been like driving and someone swerved out of their lane and almost hit you, and you're like, ah, it kind of freaks you out a little bit, right? Well, if that's the case and you are kind of freaking out a little bit, if the moment's over, why are you still freaked out, right? Like it's like, oh, they got back into their lane, you know, they drove along normally. You've been driving for 5 minutes, everything's fine, but you're still like, you're still like really anxious after that moment, right? That's your sympathetic nervous system. You went into fight or flight mode, and unfortunately, it takes a little bit of time to calm down. Your parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest, needs to sort of relax, right? So again, the central nervous system, that is your brain and your spinal cord. Your peripheral nervous system is all of the peripheral nerves that branch out from that spinal cord. And its job is to like activate muscles and also gather information in order to get it to the brain. Now, that is going to divide into two primary divisions, right? Like I said, it's going to divide into the somatic division, that's your voluntary movements, and the autonomic division, that is your involuntary movements, right? So the somatic nervous system cover areas of the body that are largely responsible for controlling things like skeletal muscle, right? Controlling, you know, muscles that are actually going to move your body around. Versus the autonomic nervous system, which supplies information to the involuntary systems, your digestive system, your cardiorespiratory system, your endocrine system, all these things that are constantly working without you having to think about it, even though you're actually thinking about it. You know, it's still your nervous system. You're just not consciously deciding to do things, right? Like I can't just sit here and go, all right, I'm going to go for a run. I want my heart rate to be warmed up and nice and high. Quick, heart rate, get higher. Beep, 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 beep. I can't do that, right? We have no voluntary conscious control over our heart rate. It is something that is entirely autonomic. And then the other part is your autonomic nervous system divides into the fight or flight system, which is going to intensify things, or the rest and digest system, which is going to relax things. So here's a weird fun fact for you, because I know you guys might, this is sometimes a little hard to swallow, no pun intended, but when you think about like when you're exercising, exercise is very much like a stressful situation. You know, like you are putting stress on the body. You are actually like tricking your body into thinking that it is fighting for its life, you know? So it is very much a sympathetic part of your nervous system that gets activated. It intensifies your adrenaline, it activates your heart rate and speeds it up. It increases blood flow to things like skeletal muscle, and it decreases blood flow to things like your digestive system. So exercise is actually an appetite suppressant, which surprises people because I know what you guys are thinking. You're like, I am absolutely ravenous after I have like worked out. And I believe that that is true. you are absolutely going to be hungry after you worked out, because your sympathetic nervous system is going to calm down and your parasympathetic nervous system is going to go, great, let's do, now that we're nice and calm and we are relaxing, I'm going to produce the opposite of adrenaline. I'm going to produce the opposite of stress hormones. We're going to calm the body down. And now it is time to get back to digesting nutrients and getting the body repaired for the next time we might go through something stressful like that. So that's the difference between the fight or flight or the rest and digest system. It's also why sometimes you might notice you don't really have to pee when you're exercising intensely. The harder you exercise, the less likely you are to sort of use your digestive and urinary systems and stuff. Fun fact. All right, so let's look at the last little bit of our nervous system today, which is going to be our sensory receptors. So like I said, your nervous system's job is not only to like decide to make decisions and execute responses to different things, it's also in charge of like sensing info. How does it know what to do if it didn't get information coming in, right? Well, that is where you have different sensory receptors throughout your body. So a sensory receptor is a specialized receptor throughout the body that's responsible for transforming stimuli into information for the brain to be able to interpret. So it basically takes things like, wow, that's really salty, and it turns it into information that your brain can interpret. It's like, wow, that's really sweet, and interprets it into information that your brain can interpret. Things that are sweet and salty, generally your brain interprets that to go, awesome, get more of that in the body, right? There's a lot of different types of sensory receptors. There's, like I said, there's chemoreceptors. Those are like your taste buds. They sense chemical changes. Or like smelling things, that's a chemical change. Those are chemoreceptors. There's photoreceptors. Their job is to respond to light waves. So how do you know the difference between like something that's green versus something that's blue? Those are your photoreceptors that are allowing you to do that. You've got nociceptors, which are kind of unique. Those are your pain receptors. They don't turn on until you reach like a certain threshold. So they're running throughout your entire body, but they aren't necessarily painful until you get to here. Then all of a sudden the pain turns on. And that's a nociceptor. But for us trainers, we're going to spend our time talking about what are called mechanoreceptors. These are the most important receptors for us. And so what mechanoreceptors are is they're sensory receptors that sense mechanical changes, right? They're sensory receptors responsible for sensing physical changes in the environment. If a muscle is stretching, a mechanoreceptor is going to sense that. If a muscle is developing tension, a mechanoreceptor is going to sense that. If you're accelerating, a mechanoreceptor is going to sense that. So the three main types of mechanoreceptors that we're going to talk about, and this is going to be important when we get to our muscles tomorrow, are going to be muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors. And what muscle spindles are is they are these sensory receptors that live in the entire length of your muscle, and their job is to sense the length of that muscle and how quickly it's changing length. So basically, imagine, if you look at a muscle spindle, it is kind of like this coil that wraps around your muscle, right? It runs all the way from one end of the muscle to the other. And it can tell when that coil is being stretched apart or when that coil is being sort of like clamped together. If it's being like stretched apart, it's going to send a signal to the brain saying like, hey, brain, this muscle's currently at this length. It can go to about here. Currently, it's about here, right? That's what the muscle spindle's job is to send information to the brain saying, this is how long your muscle is. Again, how do I know I'm wiggling my fingers? Guess what? My muscle spindles are sending a signal saying we're at this length, and then this one's sending at this length, right? And they're all changing. It's like, we're at this length, then we're at this length. And my brain's constantly getting all that information. Think about how much your brain does every day. It's pretty crazy, right? Another sensory receptor that we've got is what's called our Golgi tendon organ. Now, this works with your muscle spindles. And this is a sensory receptor that is located in the tendon of your muscles. Its job is not to sense the length of a muscle. Its job is to sense your muscular tension and the rate of those tension changes. So a muscle spindle lives throughout the belly of the muscle, right? It runs the entire length of your muscle, right? And then that can send a signal saying how long the muscle is, right? But a Golgi tendon organ is going to live in the tendon of your muscle. It lives right in this area right here. So its job is to basically tell the brain how good of a grip this muscle has on the bone. If that tension gets really high and that muscle is at risk for losing its grip on that bone and possibly tearing, then it's going to send that signal to the brain. Meanwhile, the muscle spindle is also going to send a signal to the brain. Its job is to sense how long the muscle can get, right? So if we're looking at it, right, it's sending a signal saying like, hey, this is what length the muscle is at. And meanwhile, this receptor is saying, hey, here's what tension the muscle is at. And so both those pieces of information are going to our brain, and that is how we have our proprioception. That's how our brain understands what position it's in. You know, if I said, if I told you that your bicep is at 50% max length, which means it's at like 0% tension, right? You would probably know 50% max. If this is 100% length of my bicep, this is 0% max length of my bicep, 50% would be about here, right? So I could even tell you, I could say like, hey, I want you to imagine a person whose biceps are at 50% max length, their medial deltoid is at 50% max length, so their external rotators are at like 0% max length. So you'd be like, all right, 0% means fully contracted. So that would be my, external rotators are fully contracted. I said my shoulders are at 50% max length. So that would be here, right? Because this would be fully shortened. This is fully lengthened. So it'd be halfway in between. And if I said my elbows are at 50%, right? I'd be flexing. So you'd be able to literally sort of figure it out if I gave you enough information. Well, luckily you don't have to. Your brain does that. So your brain is going to take all that information in and understand where it is in space. Now, there are also joint receptors, which is going to pivot us into our skeletal system here in just a second. Joint receptors, they live within the joint of a muscle. They're more of a skeletal system situation. Their job is to sense where a joint, like the structures within a joint, like a ligament or a raphe, right? Like their job is to basically send an information to the brain to say like, hey, here's the joint's maximum range of motion. Here's how much tension's in the joint. Here's how much accelerating's happening. Here's how much decelerating's happening. Oh, look at this. Here's kinesthesia. Yeah, this is kind of fun. So you can see this person's blindfolded, but they still know that their quadricep is contracting because there are muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and joint receptors that are sending that signal up to the brain. Let's get a fun picture. That's how we know that we are still moving around. May not be perfect without vision, but it is still proprioception. So your nervous system is really cool. It is going to adapt and respond to stress the same way your muscular system is. By exercising regularly, you are going to develop your nervous system because you are going to be using it very regularly. And that regular activity is going to cause really positive changes in that nervous system. And that's about it for the nervous system. Any questions on that, guys? Anything that wasn't clear or that you're worried about?
All good.
Radio silence. All right. That had better have been the greatest explanation of all time. All right, so let's take a look at our bones here. So moving into our skeletal system, right? If we are talking about your skeletal system, its job is to provide a framework for the body, right? Like that's its job. It's protecting delicate structures. It's giving you shape, right? And it's also providing a resting ground for all of your muscles because your muscles are going to be able to contract and actually like move you around this world, right? So there's going to be your skeletal system is made up of a series of bones, and bones are going to be these organs that act as levers for your muscular system to manipulate. So, if I want to be able to, put something up on a shelf over here, and I've got my big humerus bone, and I've got like my radius and my ulna and all the bones in my hand, right? Well, then luckily that gives me the ability to kind of reach this shelf, right? And I've got these muscles that can kind of manipulate these bones, right? So I might have like a muscle that contracts in the deltoid, that raises my arm up. I've got a muscle that's going to contract in my bicep, that's going to pull this way, right? My tricep's going to extend my arm, right? So I'm going to move my arm in this position here. My bones are the levers that are allowing the muscles to have something to manipulate. Otherwise, we'd be these, kind of squishy sacks on the ground that wouldn't really move around very well, like a slug, which has muscles, but doesn't exactly move very efficiently, or a jellyfish. So, by providing these long levers for your muscles to attach to, they can be manipulated in order for us to be able to produce actual movement. Now, looking at your bones, we've got sort of two primary divisions of the skeletal system here. You've got your axial skeleton, which is going to be your skull, your rib cage, and all of your vertebrae. And you've got your appendicular skeleton, which are going to be your arms and your legs. So if we look at like axial versus appendicular skeleton, you can see here's the two primary divisions here, right? The axial skeleton protects your central nervous system, and your appendicular skeleton moves us around the world, right? Your pelvis attached to your legs, your scapula attached to your arms. And so those two primary divisions obviously are going to move in very different ways. That's what we are going to spend a lot of our career analyzing. Now, your bones are not just like static tissue. Like a lot of times, like when we think of like, we think about like finding a skeleton. You think about like, you see these in like movies and stuff. We come along a skeleton one day, right? It's been out in the desert for years. We look at these things, we think that they're kind of like fossilized, hard tissue that doesn't really exist anymore. It's like dead tissue, right? Because that's the only thing that we ever see. But your bones are very much alive, the same way that your muscles and your brain and your skin, like everything, they are actively, they're not just like passive pieces of calcium. There's cells, just like everything else is, right? Like when we see the bone that's left over, we're not seeing any other cells, right? Like we're not seeing any of the other like cell stuff. We're only seeing the leftover calcium of a skeleton when we come upon it, but inside your body, your bones are very much alive. And so they are constantly growing, breaking down and regrowing. And so we have to understand how that works. Lorianne, this is we were talking about osteoporosis, right? This is the main section for you right now, right? So when we talk about bone growth, right, your bone are constantly going through this process that we call bone remodeling. And bone remodeling is where basically your body recycles the ingredients to make new bone tissue and lays it back down and adds it to any of the new stuff that you might have eaten recently. So you've got two primary types of cells here that are responsible for this remodeling process. You've got osteoclasts, which are these specialized cells that are in charge of like resorbing old bone tissue. Their job is to like break down any imperfect bone tissue. So osteoclasts are your bone breakers, right? When you think about like what an osteoclast does, it is going to basically come along and kind of shave away imperfect like bone tissue, right? Actually, that's great. You can actually kind of, oh no, yeah. You can kind of see, right? Maybe there's some like imperfections in the bone, and osteoclast, you can kind of see it's like working its way over that bone and it's going to eat it, right? It's literally going to kind of shave away any imperfections there. Trying to find a good picture of like, I want to see like some microfractures or something. Come on, internet, help me out. Give me what I want. I don't know how to describe it. You know what? I'll just kind of draw my own version here. So imagine, you've got like bone tissue that might, look something kind of like this, right? Ideally, this would be like a nice straight line, but maybe you were exercising really hard. And so you created like a little tiny like micro fracture, right? So the bone kind of split a little bit, picture like a stick, like with like little like slices of wood, like little pieces, right? Well, that little micro fracture, that little like imperfection, not really going to cause too much damage, right? That's not real damage. It's not going to harm you. It's not going to really affect you in any really negative way. Other than the fact that it compromised your bone. If you end up with too much of these microfractures, eventually you have compromised, wholly bone tissue, right? So luckily we've got these osteoclasts, and they're going to come along and they're going to kind of eat all this up. They're going to kind of like take all this and shave down any of those imperfections, right? And when it does that, afterwards, you've got a second type of cell, which is called an osteoblast. And an osteoblast is a specialized cell that's responsible for building up new bone tissue. These are your bone builders, right? So you've got bone breakers in the form of osteoclasts, and you've got bone builders in the form of osteoblasts. And so an osteoblast is going to come along afterwards, and it's going to go, all right, well, I'm going to lay down some new bone tissue and fix this and make it a little bit more resistant to damage. So then it comes along and lays down some new bone tissue, which you can see is a little bit thicker because it's adding, new ingredients together. So you would think that your osteoblasts and your osteoclasts are mortal enemies because one's constantly breaking down what the other one kind of built up, but they actually work together really, really well. They actually get along quite well because your osteoclasts are designed to basically eat away your bone tissue. And then they go through a process called apoptosis, where they literally self-destruct. They basically eat all this calcium. They've got all this extra calcium and collagen and proteins and stuff. And they go, great, I got it all. And then they kind of blow up. And that releases all that calcium and all the collagen and proteins and things like that into the area. And then your osteoblast comes along afterwards, and it basically spits down this kind of glue-like structure that attracts calcium ions. And so then all that calcium that's floating in the air from where the osteoclast blew up is now going to get absorbed thanks to what the osteoblast laid down. So when we're young, our osteoblasts, our bone builders, are super, super, super active, but as we get older, our osteoclasts, our bone breakers, actually become more active. And this is why bone density issues are so commonly problems for women who are going through like menopause, especially, but also just anybody who are in like their early 70s. We see osteoporosis, which is, again, compromised bone tissue, right? We're seeing bone tissue that is, normal bone tissue is very, very dense. This is very undense. There's a lot of holes. There's a lot of like porous. This is much more likely to fracture than something like this. So how do we fix that? Well, in particular, weight-bearing exercise at high intensity, so lifting relatively heavy actually, has been shown to create a lot of little micro fractures in the bones, which might make you say, wait a minute, don't we want to not fracture our bones? But remember, we're talking micro good fractures. This is the good type of fractures. Just like when you're exercising in the gym, you're not building muscle, you're tearing muscle, you're ruining your muscle, which is why your body goes, oh, I need more muscle. If you keep tearing this stuff down, I'm going to make it bigger and more resistant to damage. So lifting heavy weights has a really positive impact on bone density because it triggers your osteoclasts to break any of those imperfections down. And then your osteoblasts realize that they have to become much more active to lay down new bone tissue, which is why it's very important to regularly exercise. Any questions on that, guys? Moving into our next section. Comments, concerns?
No, thank you though.
Okay, so let's take a look at our bone markings here. So obviously all of our bones kind of have, different shapes. We have different types of bones, different bone markings, right? So on your bone markings, you're going to see what are called your what's up, Andres?
Sorry.
No problem at all. Are these big long knobs on the end of your bones. Okay, so your epiphyses are typically where we are going to see what we call your spongy bone or your white bone. This is where you're creating a lot of like your bone, your white blood cells and things like that. And then you've also got your diaphyses, which is sort of the main shaft of a bone, and that's where you're creating your red blood cells. Like I said, we've got a lot of different types of bones. We have short bones. Short bones are short. They're kind of similar in length and width. They're sometimes called cuboid bones or cubical bones. You'll sometimes hear that term as well. But they're basically like little tiny short bones. They often make up like the little bones in your wrist or the bones in your ankle. Those are really good examples of short bones. Then you've also got flat bones. Flat bones tend to be kind of flat in nature. They tend to be very protective. Your skull is a good example of a flat bone, your scapula here. Actually, it's funny. I forgot to, I don't see my picture for long bones. We've also got long bones, which is kind of the example we were looking at earlier. Long bones are longer than anything, than they are short, so if short bones are kind of similar in height and length, or length and width, your long bones are very long, but maybe not that wide. Then you've got irregular bones, which have a really unique shape and a really unique function. Each of your individual vertebrae are considered unique bones or irregular bones because they are just very uniquely shaped. So those are sort of the main big categories of our bones. And then we've got different really cool markings on our bones, right? You've either got like flattened or indented portions of your bones. We call that a depression. Or we've got like projections from our bones, which we call processes. So when we look at our bones and your bone markings are basically these specialized shapes on our bones that are acting as sites for like our muscles or maybe other connective tissue to be able to have something to get a good grip on, Depressions are basically like little dents in a muscle that allow like a muscle to maybe like kind of feed into that dent so it can get a really good grip. And then a process is maybe like a projection, which allows a muscle to get like a really good grip, right? So we've got a lot of different types of processes and depressions throughout the body. But either way, their shape, their form, allows them to be able to, fit from one bone into another and then have this mobility while also having muscles that are making it easy to get a good grip so that they can manipulate the bones, right? So some of the most important bones in your body are going to be your vertebral column. This is going to be things like your cervical spine, your thoracic spine, your lumbar spine, and your sacrum and coccyx. All of that makes up your vertebrae. That is housing your central nervous system, or at least part of it, right? It's housing the spinal cord. And then it allows sort of a nexus there where the peripheral nervous system can branch out and travel away from that central nervous system. So your vertebral column is going to protect all of that. That's why when we hear about like a broken spine, it often results in like paralysis because it is often severing the connection that your central nervous system has to the rest of the body. So that's what your bones are, right? They're these hard structures that can be manipulated to create human movement. Well, you've also got where your bones are coming together. And that is going to be what we call a joint. Or more common, well, not more commonly, but more scientifically, we call that an articulation. where one bone is meeting up with another, that place where they are meeting, that joint, that is an articulation. And so a joint is the articulation of two or more bones coming together, because there's a lot of times, like in your short bones, for instance, in your wrist, there's lots of, you might have like 4 joints for one singular bone. Now, we have a lot of different types of motions that we create when we are moving our joints. When we're moving our bones around and we're manipulating our joints, there's a lot of different types of joint motions, but there's 3 primary categories. We're going to call joint motion, by the way, we're going to call that arthrokinematics. Arthro from the word meaning joint, kinematic meaning motion, so joint motion. The 3 primary types of movements that we see inside of a joint are going to be rolling actions, sliding actions, and spinning actions. So you might have like in your radius and your ulna, for instance, right? When you look at your radius and your ulna, you'll notice they have 2 sort of circular shapes, right? There's a circular shape up here, and there's a circular shape down here, and they are able to pivot along one another. So one sort of houses the other kind of like this, and it kind of spins like that. That's a spinning joint action. So the head of your radius rotating on the head of your humerus during pronation and supination, right? When I pronate and supinate like this, that is very much a spinning action. Now we've also got like rolling actions in our joints. When you think about like your knee joint or my elbow joint, right? If my elbow is going back and forth like this, that's a rolling action where, one bone is kind of rolling along the surface of another bone, kind of like that. So the elbow is a good example of that as well. Because you can see it's literally going to fit in this little notch right here and allow that rolling action to sort of occur. And then we've also got sliding actions. When you think about like your wrists, all those little tiny, 4, like I said, there could be 4 joints for one little bone. Think about like one little bone as it's like kind of sliding, maybe they're sliding across each other up and down or front to back or side to side, right? That sliding action is another type of joint movement. So your knee actually does a simultaneous roll and slide whenever you are doing like a squat or like moving your knee joint. When you are doing this kind of action like this in your knee joint, it is not only rolling, it is also sliding a little bit like this. And so it actually kind of rolls and simultaneously slides forward and then slides back and rolls kind of like that. So it's kind of a unique action there, but those are sort of the 3 primary movements. And then we've got all these kind of uniquely shaped joints that are going to allow us to create those 3 primary types of movements. So the classification you've got, so NASM is actually a little oversimplified here. You've basically got 3 types of joints inside the body, but they're breaking it down into 2 major categories. So you've got synovial joints, which are probably the joints that you're thinking of. 80% of the joints in your body are synovial joints. They're the movable joints. They're like, what allows us to do all of our stuff. But then you've also got non-synovial joints, which are still important, but they're not something that we manipulate all that often because they're not movable. They're for the most part either semi-movable or fully just totally not movable joints. So your non-synovial joints, you've got some of them that are called fibrous joints. The sutures of your skull, for instance, are a really good example of this, like where your bones have literally grown together so that it's kind of like one big bone at this point. That is a fully immovable fibrous joint. Technically, they're 2 separate bones, but I mean, honestly, they never move. So it's, for the purposes of it, you can kind of consider it one bone. But you've also got semi-movable cartilaginous joints. Whoa. That way. Cartilaginous joints are semi-movable joints, like for instance, your vertebrae, right? It's designed to be able to do a little bit of rotation, a little bit of side-to-side movement, but it's not really like moving through a big range of motion the way the rest of your body is, right? Or even looking at like your pelvis here, this is called your pubic symphysis, right? I want my pelvis to be able to do a little bit of movement like this and that and maybe this, but I don't want it to do a lot of movement, right? That's going to be way too much. When we actually do see too much movement in the pelvis, it creates a lot of pain. And it can create like a lot of what we call QL pain. Oh God, I got hiccups. So then the joints, like I said, we're going to spend most of our time talking about synovial joints. Synovial joints are joints that actually have like a very large joint cavity. And they also have like specialized structures that allow for greater movement. So this has, you know, fibrous joints especially. There's like no space between fibrous joints. They're literally kind of like glued together, right? Cartilaginous joints, there's a little bit of space, but the only thing between them is the cartilage, right? That's the only thing that's like separating one bone from another. But in a synovial joint, there's actually a joint cavity. There's actually this like big bubble that kind of surrounds the joint. And there's also going to be a lot of like little structures within that synovial joint, like ligaments, for instance, that are going to allow for like a greater attachment there. So when we think about like synovial joints, these are your, like I said, they're fully movable joints. They have these special structures. They are going to have synovial fluid, which is sort of this like egg white looking material. It's this like a goo that lives inside your joint that decreases friction. They're going to have cartilage just like your cartilaginous joints do, which is sort of the smooth tissue that also prevents friction. Sometimes they'll have little things called fat pads, which you can see here, which is again designed to reduce friction. Sometimes you'll see bursa, which are these little fluid-filled sacs. You can see like right here, this little fluid-filled sac that's preventing this muscle from rubbing on the bone. And sometimes you'll see you know, other materials in there as well. But the big one, the big connective tissue that we spend most of our time talking about that's within synovial joints are going to be our ligaments. And ligaments are these structures that attach like one bone to another. So if you think about like how our muscles are attached to our skeleton, they're attached with connective tissue called tendons. Well, the way that your skeleton stays attached to itself is through cartilage or ligaments, and a ligament is going to attach, you know, one bone to another. So when you look at like ligaments, you know, they are this sort of like we always kind of draw it as sort of this like white tissue because like it's very poor. It has very poor blood flow. We're actually going to see that here in the next slide. Your joint connective tissue, your ligaments, they connect your bone to your bone. Like this is your femur being attached to your fibula, right? That's your LCL ligament. This is what's called your lateral collateral ligament. And it just does not have a lot of blood flow. It's the type of connective tissue that because it doesn't get very much blood flow, it repairs very, 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 very slowly. And so if you are continually putting stress on your ligaments, let's say because you have maybe altered joint mechanics or bad posture, it's going to put continual stress out and it's going to repair very slowly, which means eventually you're probably going to tear that ligament. You're going to experience an ankle sprain, or you'll get like maybe a tendinopathy or tendonitis. Connective tissue does not easily repair as quickly as other types of tissue in the body because it just doesn't get as many nutrients delivered because it doesn't have as much blood flow, which means that we have to be, you know, we have to do exercises that result in blood flow getting into those joints so that we can repair it, right? And we need to be able to analyze, looking at our clients' movements and understand maybe what their movement compensations are. If they compensate their movements and they move in a way that they're not supposed to, they're putting too much stress on that connective tissue, and that's likely what's going to cause some type of breakdown or tear or injury. So, good news about our skeletal system, right? Is that weight-bearing exercise in particular has really, really, really positive effects on repairing our skeletal, nervous, and muscular systems. Running, lifting weights, body weight exercises, all of those things have really positive effects on the skeletal system because they are particularly like weight bearing, which means they're working against gravity. Now, swimming and cycling are really good for you and they're very good for your cardiorespiratory system, but they're not actually weight bearing exercise. And so weirdly enough, swimming and cycling don't exactly have the same positive effects in terms of bone density that we're going to get out of lifting weights. Lifting weights is probably one of the best ways to build up your bone tissue and develop your bone density. We really, really like lifting heavy weights for sort of combating osteoporosis. So summarizing everything up today, 3 components of the kinetic chain are going to be your nervous system, your muscular system, and your skeletal system. Your nervous system is the control center. It is going to use sensory function to gather information, integrative function to interpret that information, and motor function to execute the appropriate response to that information. It is going to coordinate and control your entire body, including your muscular system, which we will dive into tomorrow. And that muscular system is going to manipulate and move around your skeletal system. And your skeletal system is the body's framework made up of bones and joints and the structures within those joints. And that is actually our first lecture for this course. That's about all I have got for you guys today. So your guys' job is to dive into that textbook, dive into chapter 2, and you don't have to read the entire chapter today, but read the first part of it, get through the nervous system section and get through the skeletal system section. As soon as it starts talking about muscles, go ahead and stop. That is sort of the end of your homework for the day. I don't have any actual physical homework for you guys. I've just got the assigned reading for you today. Any questions, guys?
Sounds good.
All right. Solid, guys. Kenny, Bay, you
Sounds
guys?
good.
Love it. Lorianne,
Okay.
okay. Solid. All right. Cool. Well, guys, yeah, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's lecture. Please do your reading. Take a half hour off. That's what I always tell people. Like, take 30 minutes to let your brain cool down for a minute and then come back to it. You know, like, it's really a lot better. It actually, I mean, you'll absorb it better. And look for an email from me later today. That email will have a link to the YouTube video so that we recorded this. You know, it's recording right now. It'll have a link to this in case you want to watch it again, which I always recommend as well. It will also have a copy of the PowerPoints. And then my email today will include the day-by-day for this class, as well as sort of the Sochi schedule. And other than that, I will see you guys bright and early tomorrow morning.
Okay. Thanks, Brad.
Of course. See